Okay, in this set of videos, we're going to start going over indirect fire. Now, I'm going to break it up over a multitude of videos just because there is a lot of different things that you have to consider and keep track of when it comes to indirect fire, and it's more than I can include in just a single video. There are a couple different types of indirect fire. You're going to have your offboard artillery, which you're going to keep track of on one of the player aids, similar to the one that I have on screen for you now. With that, you can keep track of all the different types of offboard artillery you could have, and some of them will have different strengths as well. Then you have things like onboard artillery units, and those units are going to have a gray triangle to their left side. I've got a couple examples set out here. You see this is a self-propelled mortar, and here is a self-propelled artillery gun. Both have the gray triangle signifying them as capable of indirect fire. And another tip for that is you can tell by the extreme range that these units tend to have as well. Now, for an onboard artillery unit to conduct a indirect fire mission, obviously they can't be ops complete or disrupted, but they're also going to require a spotter unit, which can be things like this recon unit that I have here. I'll touch more on spotters here in just a second. But also, when it comes to your onboard artillery units, they don't have to just perform indirect fire. They can perform a direct fire action if they have range and line of sight to enemy units on their own. And when they're conducting a direct fire on their own accord, they don't have to account for drift like they would when conducting indirect fire. And it just has to do with the scale that this game is played in. 5 to 15 minutes worth of real life versus what's happening on a game turn, to signify that if they're performing a direct fire attack, more than likely they're going to get the attack on target when they can see what they're firing at. So when it comes to spotters, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to need those to conduct the indirect fire. And a spotter can be anything from an HQ unit like this one, or, like I said, a recon unit that has a red triangle like this one here, or on your national unit table, some other units will be listed down as capable of performing a spotter check. As an example, this Jeep is capable of performing a spotter check according to the national unit table for the U.S. forces. Now, when I say a spotter check, it's very similar to other things that we've discussed before. It's basically conducting a morale check. Again, you can use the HQ modifier if they're stacked with the unit that's performing the spotter check. But if this Jeep were to do it, they would roll 2d6 compared against their morale value listed down on their unit card. And if it's equal to or under, they're going to pass. But if it's greater than their morale value, they're going to be marked as ops complete and no attack's going to take place. Now, excluding the failure of the spotting check that I was just talking about, when you do have a unit that spots, like say this recon unit spots for indirect fire, the only unit that's actually going to be marked ops complete once that indirect fire is done is the unit that performed the indirect fire. Your spotting unit does not get marked ops complete. Now, indirect fire can have some range restrictions. If it's a off-board attack, it can be called into any hex that the spotter can actually observe. That's no problem. But if it's from an onboard unit, there can be restrictions when it comes to the range. If it's a towed artillery or self-propelled artillery unit, there's going to be a 7 hex minimum range required for the attack to take place. But if it's a mortar or a self-propelled mortar, it's just going to depend on what caliber of weapon they have. If it's 120 millimeters or greater, then they're going to have a minimum of 2 hexes. And if it's less than 120 millimeters, there's not going to be a minimum range required.